Sandy changed at least 3 jobs before she settled on the job of the maid in the house of Alfred Rodriguez. Unfortunately, having arrived in Chicago from out of town, Sandy was willing to take on virtually any job, which caused her to get scammed a couple of times. Since the Rodriguez family had a big house and some land, they had a gardener, a cook, and another maid working for them in addition to Sandy. The other maid's name was Norma Walker. She was a young, contentious beauty who disliked the new housekeeper at first sight. "Who taught you to clean the floor like that? You're leaving stains and there's dirt in the corners." Maybe this was considered okay back in your village, but that won't slide here, Nora grumbled indignantly. Frankly, her partner's nitpicking was groundless, but Sandy preferred not to aggravate the situation and quietly endured her criticism. The woman really couldn't afford to lose her job, which was so hard for her to find. But there was something else that kept Sandy in that house. The thing was, the maid had a little son, and unfortunately, the responsibility of raising him fell entirely on her fragile shoulders. At first, Sandy tried to keep him a secret, but then one day, her roommate fell ill, and she had no one to take care of her son while she was at work. Thus, Sandy ended up having to bring Billy to work with her. Great, now she dragged her son to work with her, Norma complained to the gardener. But the older man just shook his head and declined to comment. He didn't want to criticize the single mother, while Norma's constant whining annoyed him more than anything else. It should be noted that little Billy behaved very well and didn't give his mother any trouble. The kiddo understood that it wasn't easy for her, and therefore he was very quiet and virtually invisible. But Norma Walker still managed to blame the kiddo for a couple of things and kept pestering Sandy about them. Despite the fact that Alfred Rodriguez allowed Sandy to bring her son to work, Norma did everything to ensure that the young maid was fired as soon as possible. That was partially caused by the fact that Norma was feeling jealous. She had her eye on the owner's son, who was good-looking and, most importantly, single. Daydreaming about him, Norma imagined herself the wife of the wealthy heir, who would be able to provide her with a carefree lifestyle. But after Sandy came to work at the Rodriguez house, Norma no longer felt as confident in the power of her beauty as she did before. That was caused by the fact that Sandy wasn't bad-looking either. Moreover, she had a soft and accommodating nature. What if this beggar makes Oliver fall in love with her? I can't let that happen, the maid thought. In fact, Sandy wasn't the least bit interested in any kind of relationship with the owner's son. All she dreamed of was providing her own son with everything he needed for a comfortable life. The woman never told anyone who Billy's father was and preferred to keep the secret buried deep in her heart. Norma tried to ask a couple of questions about it, but ran into a blank wall of silence and only occasionally managed to get some evasive answers out of Sandy. It must have been a one-night stand or something, and now she's dealing with the consequences, Norma thought, grinning smugly. She didn't feel sorry for Sandy. First and foremost, she saw Sandy as a competitor that could take her place as the most beautiful woman in the house. Billy soon got used to the house of Alfred and Barbara Rodriguez and knew perfectly well where each of the rooms was located and where he was and wasn't allowed to go. The only room that the boy never went into was the study of the owner's son, who wasn't home all that often. Oliver Rodriguez was a businessman and didn't like it when someone went into his office without permission. Knowing this, Norma decided to exploit this fact to get rid of the hated maid once and for all. Thus, she told little Billy that he should go take a look at the books in Oliver's bookcase. Wouldn't Mr. Rodriguez get mad? The boy asked cautiously. No, it's okay. Don't worry about it. There are a lot of books there, even some fairy tales. I saw them myself. Norma lied without batting an eye. She was well aware that Sandy was putting things in order in the pantry at the time, so she simply couldn't keep track of her son. Taking little Billy by the hand, Norma led him to Oliver's office and quietly opened the door for him. Come on, go ahead. See that closet by the wall? Go check it out, the maid said, pushing the boy forward. She knew that Oliver would come home from work in a few minutes and would immediately find the intruder in his office. Since the young man was rather short-tempered, Norma expected him to get mad and fire Sandy on the spot. Unfortunately, it took Sandy quite some time to realize that her son was gone. By the time she did, the boy was already flipping through the books on the floor of Oliver's study. The boy was very fond of fairy tales, but just as much as he liked listening to them, he also liked looking at the colorful illustrations, and there were lots of them in Oliver's books. Having gotten completely lost in the process, the boy didn't even notice when the owner's son came into his office. "Whose child is this? And what's going on here?" Oliver exclaimed. Startled, Billy turned around and saw a tall, thin man in a business suit standing in front of him. "I'm sorry, sir. I was told I can come in here." The boy tried to explain himself, but Oliver didn't want to hear anything about it. Oliver's indignation knew no bounds. His cheeks were flushed and his eyes seemed to glow with anger. But there was also something that made Oliver feel very uncomfortable. The little boy looked a lot like his late brother, which had to be a coincidence, of course. At that moment, Norma appeared behind Oliver and started complaining that Sandy's son was simply unbearable. "I told him that he couldn't go into your office, but he did it anyway." Norma continued to lie. Snorting indignantly, Oliver told Norma to get the boy's mother. "Well, that's it. Now she's going to get fired, and I won't have to worry about her ever again," the maid thought, hiding a smile in the corner of her lips. Having heard that Oliver was asking for her, Sandy turned pale and immediately realized that she was in some kind of trouble. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes when she thought that she could get fired. Sandy had never even been to Oliver's office before, because Norma was always the one to clean it. Seeing her son standing next to the young man, the woman understood everything without words. "I'm sorry, sir. This will never, ever happen again. I promise." Sandy started right away. Deep down, Oliver wasn't really mad at the new housekeeper. He understood that the boy was at that age when he wanted to explore and didn't understand that there were things he couldn't do. But on the other hand, the man also didn't want to turn the house into the boy's playground. "Since this has never happened before, I'll forgive you, but if it does happen again, you'll be fired," Oliver said with an icy tone. Sandy had already taken a breath in order to give an exhaustive answer when she saw something on the wall that made her eyes suddenly fill with tears and her cheeks turn white as chalk. "What's wrong with you? Are you sick?" Oliver asked with concern in his voice. Mad at himself for his hot temper, the man approached the maid, who looked like she could faint at any moment. Meanwhile, Sandy just stood there, looking at the photograph in the black frame hanging on the wall. She knew the young man in the picture. Moreover, this man was a very big part of her past, which Sandy returned to in her thoughts more and more often. At that moment, the woman's mind went dizzy as the whirlpool of thoughts and memories transported her several years back. Immersed in thoughts of her past, Sandy no longer heard Oliver's words and Norma's excuses, desperately trying to bring her back to her senses. Sandy was now far away. She was back to the time when she just graduated from high school and was starting a new adult life. She lived with her mother in the suburbs of Chicago back then and didn't even think about moving to the metropolis. Sandy never knew her father, while Samantha Jackson tried to talk about it as little as possible. Despite the fact that Sandy studied well at school, her classmates didn't like her. This was due to the fact that the girl's family was poor, and therefore she couldn't even afford to buy new clothes. She mostly had to wear hand-me-downs or clothes her mother got at flea markets or thrift stores. At that age, children are often cruel and outright mean towards their poorer peers. And that was exactly the case with Sandy, who often felt like a black sheep. After finishing school, the young woman refused to go to college and wanted to get a job instead. However, Samantha Jackson managed to change her daughter's mind and convinced her to apply to a university. "It's your future, honey. If you don't get an education, you'll end up like me, having to work as a cleaner at some roadside motel until the end of your days," Samantha Jackson said. It's hard to say how Sandy's life would have turned out if she hadn't met a man named Justin. He had wealthy parents, but he came to visit his grandmother every summer. He raced on his motorcycle, swam in the river, and threw loud parties. Sandy and Justin met accidentally at one of the man's gatherings. Even Sandy couldn't really understand how and why she ended up at that party. Most likely, she simply went there with her friend who knew Justin. Despite the abundance of all kinds of alcohol, there weren't any unfortunate events. The young people danced, listened to music, and had lots of fun, making all the neighbors feel jealous. Since Sandy never allowed herself to stay late, she started getting ready to go home as soon as it turned 11. Justin happened to be the one who offered to take her home. The young man wanted to ride his bike on the night road. But when he offered to give Sandy a lift, the young woman refused adamantly. No, not today. You've had a lot to drink, so there's no reason why you should get on that bike, Sandy added. Come on. It wouldn't be the first time. Justin grinned, but didn't insist. Instead, he walked Sandy home, asking her permission to see her again. The next day, Justin came to pick Sandy up on his motorcycle, after which the young people went for a picnic by the river. Justin was an excellent driver, and he loved speed more than anything else in his life. Fast driving and the whistle of the wind in his ears literally drove the young man crazy. The first date was followed by the second, and then the third. Soon, Sandy found herself in a romantic relationship, the kind she only read about in books. To Justin's credit, it's worth saying that he was a good boyfriend and surrounded the young woman with all kinds of care and attention that she never knew before. Samantha Jackson was the only one against their relationship. Being smart, Samantha realized that Justin's wealthy parents were unlikely to welcome her poor daughter into their family. Of course, Justin didn't think that way. Unfortunately, Sandy's mother was actually right. Justin's parents considered his relationship with some young woman from the village to be an insignificant fling that would end as soon as their son returned to Chicago. But time passed, and Justin was still faithful to Sandy. In the depths of her mind, the young woman was already planning their wedding and was expecting Justin to propose any day. Everything changed in an instant when Justin got into an accident on a warm October day. Having gone over the speed limit, the young man lost control of his bike and crashed into a truck that was carrying some wooden logs. The truck driver didn't do anything wrong, and the officers investigating the accident immediately cleared him. It was Justin's love for speed that caused the accident and his untimely death. Sandy learned about the death of her beloved from the evening news. That day, Justin was going to visit his parents and promised to come back in a couple of days. It's hard to even imagine what the unfortunate young woman had to go through before she could finally come to her senses, at least a little bit. Sandy didn't attend the funeral because she didn't know Justin's parents and was afraid to face them. The woman cried for days and nights on end, thinking of the life that she could never get back. At that moment, Sandy had no idea that fate had another surprise in store for her, which she would soon learn about. It all started with the fact that one fine morning, Sandy felt very dizzy and nauseous. At first, the young woman thought that it was all because of the stress. Nevertheless, she took her mother's advice and took a pregnancy test. That was when she found out that she was going to be a mother. It's hard to even imagine what the poor woman was feeling back then, being pregnant with her dead boyfriend's baby. Despite her mother's opinion, Sandy was determined to have the baby and didn't even allow the thought of terminating the pregnancy. The young woman felt terrible throughout the entire pregnancy. She felt dizzy and nauseous, and her entire body ached. But when Sandy gave birth to the beautiful baby, her joy knew no bounds. The only problem was by that time, Samantha Jackson was already showing signs of a terrible hereditary disease. By an evil twist of fate, the woman wasn't destined to help take care of her grandson, whom she only got to see at the hospital. Samantha Jackson passed away 6 months after the birth of little Billy. At that moment, Sandy cursed fate for treating her so cruelly, taking away her beloved boyfriend and mother in such a short time. But on the other hand, it was the birth of her son that saved Sandy from the depression that she'd fallen into after the death of her mother. Since there were no prospects for the single mother in the small town, Sandy decided to move to Chicago and start a new life. After waiting for her son to grow up a bit, the woman packed up her things and moved. And now, by yet another evil twist of fate, she ended up in the house of her late boyfriend. Of course, Sandy knew Justin's last name, but it was so common that the young woman didn't even suspect that it could be the same Rodriguez family. Only then did Sandy remember Justin telling her that he had a younger brother living in Chicago. Standing in Oliver Rodriguez's office, Sandy realized that he was Justin's brother. The maid came closer to the photograph of her late boyfriend and gently stroked it with her hand. "Did you know my brother?" Oliver asked in surprise. Looking at the man, Sandy smiled and nodded. What she shared a little later didn't just shock Oliver, but his parents too. Tears froze in the eyes of Alfred and Barbara Rodriguez when they realized that all this time, Justin's son was so close. Of course, they knew that their late son had a girlfriend who lived in the suburbs of Chicago. But after Justin's funeral, the couple withdrew into themselves and cut all communications with their son's friends and acquaintances. Having picked Billy up, Alfred hugged him and kissed him on the cheek. "He really does look exactly like Justin. How did I not see it right away?" Barbara Rodriguez said with tears in her eyes. At that moment, the only person who didn't feel happy was Norma, who had no choice but to admit defeat. Being kind and honest, Barbara and Alfred Rodriguez invited Sandy to stay in their house and live with them for as long as she'd like. Now that Sandy wasn't alone anymore, her life had changed for the better. A little while later, the Rodriguez couple was delighted to see that a relationship developed between Sandy and Oliver. At first, it was solely based on mutual respect, and only then turned into something more than an ordinary relationship. Having become Oliver's wife, Sandy was sure that their marriage was blessed from above, and that Justin was looking at them from heaven and was sincerely happy for the newlyweds, wishing them nothing but family happiness.